In the last lecture, we looked at the four basic missions and purposes of the church: worship, discipleship, mission, and unity and wholeness. In this lecture, I want to look at the important topic of the church and finances. And let me begin by going in the lecture on New Covenant giving. We looked a lot at 2 Corinthians chapters 8 and 9. Well, in 2 Corinthians chapter 8, verses 16 through 24, Paul gives some very important advice and counsel about the church and finances. Just recall, Paul was taking up a collection. He was going through Greece, taking up a collection for the beleaguered believers in Judea. And I won't read these 9 verses, but what Paul says in this passage is that he was establishing an accountability system for handling money. He did not receive the money personally, but he established a committee to receive and account for the funds. The committee consisted of 3 people, Titus and 2 other men. And each of these men was known in the churches, had been tested, and had proven himself to be trustworthy. Now, at least one of the 3 was elected by the church, not appointed by Paul. And that's in accord with the selection of deacons by the church, not appointed by the apostles in Acts 6, verse 3. So Paul is giving his apostolic authority to the decision of the church. Now, the reason for the finance committee was to make sure that the administration of the money was handled properly. And that tells us that precautions need to be taken so that no one can discredit the administration of church funds. We are accountable to God, to the church, and to other people for our handling of money, according to 2 Corinthians 8, verse 21. And as a matter of fact, chapter 8, verse 21 emphasizes the importance of integrity, which says that we have regard for what is honorable, not only in the sight of the Lord, but also in the sight of men. And so financial integrity and proper administration of money ultimately reflects on the glory of the Lord Jesus. Now, Paul's committee structure to supervise finances is consistent with the authority structure for the churches established in the rest of the New Testament. The New Testament church did not vest power in one man. And if you are in a church, and I know many churches, the ultimate authority is the pastor. That is not a biblical idea at all, and never was. The church always had, when Paul was starting churches, he always appointed multiple elders in the different cities to head the churches, because we all have strengths, we all have weaknesses, and so there was shared power. Now, because human beings are naturally sinful, it's unwise for one person, even a very godly person, to hold all the power in the local church. Therefore, a supervising body, which may include the pastor, should jointly govern the church and administer the church money. Receipts for funds should be counted, witnessed, and cross-checked by more than one person. This will prevent financial mismanagement, theft, and fraud. Now, there should be a system of church financial accountability, and it should include a number of things, in addition to being administered by more than one person. There should be a set of rules for dealing with the church funds. Handling money should conform to generally accepted accounting practices. And the integrity and credibility of the churches still today depends on the extent to which they conform to proper accounting and legal practices in the handling of money and the conduct of their business. Now, rules to protect the assets of the church and prevent abuse, to develop trust, and avoid unnecessary questioning by members should include such things as setting a salary for the pastor, in addition to the expenses payable to him. Establishing levels of expenses that require the leadership's or the congregation's approval. Document the use to which church assets can be put. In other words, are you going to allow church chairs or benches or music or sound equipment or generator to be loaned out to non-church members without a deposit? No large amounts of cash should be kept on the church premises. Instead, the church should have a bank account where it keeps its funds. And so important, you need to keep records of income and expenses. Keeping records requires developing an accounting system. And so the records should include, and again, in your book we have more detail than I'm able to give you here, but I'm trying to hit the highlights that many of you may already be doing this. But I know, particularly in certain smaller churches or non-denominational churches in East Africa, you don't do this. You're setting yourself up for fraud and failure. And particularly if the government gets involved, they're going to want to see what you do with the money. You see, accounting records should at minimum include income and expense statements, accounts receivable, accounts payable, balance sheets, bank account records. Now, you need to keep open records. In other words, the financial records of the church should be open to inspection by the members of the church. Why not? What have you got to hide? Remember, they are the ones who are giving you money. It's their money. They have the right to know what you're doing with their money. And by the way, this will give them confidence. In fact, I think most churches, certainly that I've ever been affiliated with, periodically will have somebody account for the finances. Say, during this period we received this much, and this is what it went to. That gives your people confidence that you're not just raking off the money for yourself personally, and that the money is going where it's supposed to be going. In my church now, we have a very small, like about a 1 or 2 sheet bulletin on Sundays that lists the order of service, the songs we'll be singing, and so on. But on the back, it shows what the budget was and how much has been received and how much has gone out up to date, and what the offering was last week, what the budget was, and so on. So we know what it is. That gives me confidence to know that the money is not being stolen or I'm not being defrauded. Your church members have a right to know this, and they want to know what's being done with their money. You know, people want feedback, and if you give them feedback, they're more likely to give more because they'll have confidence in you. I mean, and so we've said that one reason people don't give much is because, number one, they've never been taught how to manage their money. They don't know how to budget. We talked about that. You can teach them. Number two, many churches, they demand money on a completely wrong basis. They go to Malachi chapter 3. They hammer people with a law that does not even apply to them, instead of pointing them to Jesus and new covenant giving. And third, people don't give because they don't receive proper accountability. They don't trust you. You need to establish trust because it's dealing with their money. And so this reassures them. You should encourage input from the church members. You might have a suggestion box of where your people can make suggestions, things that they think you might, ministries you might do, where they'd like to see their money going, and so on. Every church needs to have a written budget. We talked about budgeting earlier for yourself and your families, but if you do not have a written budget, I'll tell you something. If I was attending a church and it did not have a written budget, I would leave that church because it is not a real church. That is just open to abuse. I can't trust people because, listen, yes, you're a pastor. Yes, you are a Christian, or so you say. But therefore, what have you got to hide? It is, as I say, a budget establishes accountability and gives me confidence that you know what you're doing and that my money is going where you say it's going to go. A budget should be prepared annually. In your book here on biblical stewardship, we talk in detail about the budgeting process, but it should be prepared annually. And, the different departments or ministries of the church need to submit their proposed budgets each year. The basis for the budget: what are your ministry priorities? What is the church's mission statement? What is your vision? And you need to ask yourself, do our current financial expenditures reflect the mission and vision of our church, or should they be changed? Because, as I said, when we talked about individual budgeting, I said you need to find out. I said take 3 or 4 months. Keep track of all the money that comes in and every expenditure you make, and then you add up the numbers. And I said you will probably be amazed. Right now, if you don't have a budget, if I asked you, how much did you spend last month on airtime? You couldn't tell me. How much did you spend last month on Fanta? You couldn't tell me. How much did you spend last month on transport or food or anything else? You couldn't tell me. But you get together, you find out what you're actually doing with your money. As I said, you'll probably be amazed. You'll say, I had no idea we were spending this much in this area. Or I had no idea we were giving so little to the church. It's the same with the church. You see, the point is, what you do with your money shows what you really value. And what the church does with its money shows what it really values. You may say missions and discipleship are the top priorities of this church, and then you find out you have no budget for discipleship at all. You don't even have a formal discipleship program, and your mission budget is very, very small. Most of the money's going to the sound system or to the rent or whatever it may be. And so now, in preparing the budget, you obviously have to pay the church's internal expenses. In other words, personnel, property, utilities, supplies, and so on. But the second thing is to fund the work of the external church ministry, foreign missions, domestic missions, mercy ministry, all the things, reaching out to your community, evangelism, all of those things. Now, you need to agree among the leadership, what are our priorities here? How much should be kept for the inside part? How much for the mission of the church? Scripture does not give a clear rule about this, so churches normally set their own policies. But you need to be asking the questions every year. Are we as a congregation keeping too much for ourselves? How much should go for this? How much for that? I said, in the case of myself and my wife, every year we look at how much we give to the various things we believe in and evaluate. Should we keep things at this level? Should we increase, decrease, cut one out, add something new? You need to ask the question, in light of God's word, do we as a church need to adjust our pattern of spending? Now, I have a sample budget form here in the book that can help you make your own budget form if you want. But a couple more considerations regarding the church and finances. First, the church, I think, should pay its pastor. This is indicated, for example, in 1 Corinthians 9, in verse 11, Paul says, if we sowed spiritual things in you, is it too much if we reap material things from you? And he says in verses 13 and 14, do you not know that those who perform sacred services eat the food of the temple, and those who attend regularly to the altar have their share from the altar? So also, the Lord directed those who proclaim the gospel to get their living from the gospel. This same principle is found in Romans 15, verse 17, Galatians 6:6, and 1 Timothy 5, verses 17 and 18. Now, the New Testament does not say the amount or the specific method by which the church should pay its pastor. I think the best way is to give the pastor a salary. Some churches, the pastor receives a percentage of the tithes or offerings. Now, the pastor's income should in some manner reflect the average income for the congregation. Maybe what an average school teacher makes. I don't know. But in rural subsistence farming areas, non-cash based payments can be made, for example, in agricultural produce or animals, or the people setting aside 10% of their plot and cultivating it on behalf of the church and the pastor. Obviously, in rural areas that have a lot, in urban areas that have a lot more money, the salary is going to be higher because the expenses are higher, and people have more money than they will in poorer rural areas. The pastor should not be way above the people, and I don't think he should be way below the people. And remember this. A lot of people wrongly say, well, Pastor, you are called by God. God will take care of you. Well, as I said, in Romans 15, 1 Corinthians 9, Galatians 6, and 1 Timothy 5, Paul specifically says, the church has an obligation to the pastor. The pastor has an obligation to his congregation. And yes, you have been called by God to be in church ministry. But, God is not going to magically or supernaturally pay you by opening the roof of the church and showering down shillings or francs or dollars. No, he calls the people, the congregation, to take care of the pastor. Now, in 1 Timothy 5, it says, the pastors and the elders who work hard, especially at teaching and preaching, do their job well. So what you do, how you do your job, may be reflected in how much you get. But, I think it should be a reasonable amount given the particular circumstances. The Apostle Paul, of course, as an evangelist and church planter, he sometimes worked in a so-called secular job of tent making to earn money while he was engaged in gospel ministry. Some pastors do that. But since Paul was not the pastor of a local church, his situation is not necessarily identical to that of a pastor. There are actually several reasons why I think it's harmful for a pastor to continue to support himself with outside employment after a church has become established. First, the congregation is thereby permitted to shirk its biblical responsibility of supporting the pastor. The church is robbed of the fruit of a full-time pastor because the pastor has to devote so much of his time to his income-earning job, he can't spend the time preparing good sermons, visiting the congregation, counseling, and doing all the other things the pastor needs to do. So the pastor and his ministry will be harmed. Secular work may become a snare which tempts the pastor to leave ministry. And lack of church support for the pastor becomes self-perpetuating. And therefore, I think churches also and denominations should establish a retirement fund for the pastors, because a lot of pastors, particularly in Africa, they retire with nothing. That is not good. You need to do this. Most denominations have this, but if not, you need to talk with your denomination to establish this. Now, financial management directly reflects the spiritual mission and well-being of the church. When a church rightly manages its finances, it enhances the mission of the church and shows believers and non-believers that it is the light of the world. You see, proper financial management greatly reduces the risk of abuse that may occur in the church. And as I indicated earlier, proper financial management should result in increased giving because your people will see that these are the priorities of this church and our money is going there. You see, the church, how a congregation spends its money can be viewed as moral behavior. A congregation that finds it easier to cut the missions budget because utilities or the sound system has increased, that's not moral. Rather, you should challenge your members to increase giving to pay the bills and to expand missions. You see, people tend to give more if they believe that what they are giving to is valuable. People will give more to special projects rather than just the general budget. And so, again, you need to see the finances. As I said in the earlier lecture, money is spiritual. And so money is particularly spiritual insofar as what the church does with its money. And so the many individuals will be willing to give significantly more when they're presented with a challenge to increase their giving to fund an important mission of the church. Now, as I said, any money that's given needs to be accounted for, and feedback to the people has to be given. People want to know where their money is going. One ministry that looks at church finances said that 89% of the responding pastors agreed with the statement that most church members want to know what their money is buying when in the congregation. So your people want to know this. They deserve to know this. Now, proper stewardship of finances means that churches should become self-supporting. And I know in Africa, many churches were started by Western missions, and they still have this sort of culture of dependency. That is not good. You need to become self-supporting, self-sustaining. It's important because it's biblical. All of the churches founded by Paul supported themselves rather than relying upon support from Jerusalem or foreign missionaries. It's logical. If you only have 10 families who can at least give 10% of their income, that can support a pastor full time. And even poor believers with money, if you teach them how to manage their money, they will be much better givers than they are now. The spiritual welfare of your congregation depends upon becoming self-sustaining. You see, a sense of responsibility fosters creativity and spiritual blessings. And full-time ministry workers are better off without foreign mission support. That's one reason why, here in Eclea, yes, I help to facilitate our conferences, but, I'm a Westerner. There will come a time when I'm dead, and Eclea may no longer exist. God willing, our materials will still exist, but it's not right to depend upon foreign support. You can do this on your own, and it shows whether you think this is really important or not. And because laws may change, foreign missions may be kicked out of a country, whatever it is. And you see, self-support opens the door to unlimited expansion. In our book on the church, its nature, mission, and purpose, I talk about one example from Kanju, South Korea. There is something called the Antioch Presbyterian Church. It started out and it was called the Tin Can Church because it looked like a tin can in the ground. But when they started out, they said, our goal, our commitment is 2/3 of the money we make is going to go into missions. And so they could have a much better building, and people thought, how can you grow if you're giving that much to missions? Well, they did. Now they got over 4,000 people. They fund hundreds of missionaries. They have all kinds of programs and so on. And in the last few years, they've been giving 70 to 75% of their income for mission work. That church, God has blessed them because their heart and mind and their finances are in the right place. It's not all about big sound systems. Good night. I've been in enough small churches that you don't need electric guitars or keyboards. You can use acoustic. You don't need loudspeakers and PA systems. I mean, no one has had any trouble hearing my voice, and they won't have any trouble hearing your voice. Money should go to the things that are most important to you. Now, I want to conclude this lecture by saying there are many things that local churches and denominations can do to become self-supporting. You can engage in income-generating activities, so you're not totally dependent upon the donations that you get from your members. Many churches own land, but are not using the land productively. You could plant gardens and then sell the produce. Some churches plant trees. You can sell the trees to construction companies. If they're fruit trees, you can sell the fruit and so on. One Kenyan pastor estimated that 200 to 250 eucalyptus trees could be planted on an acre of land. And I've mentioned this in earlier lectures. When mature, they sold for approximately 10,000 Kenya shillings apiece. A Ugandan pastor estimated that Irish potatoes could be sold for about 120,000 Uganda shillings per bag. And thus, an acre of land planted with Irish potatoes could be worth from 5 to 10 million Uganda shillings. Why aren't your churches doing things like this with your land? Because this is all renewable money for the church. One Kenyan Anglican diocese began a piggery, and the bishop required each of his parishes to own its own cow. You know, churches can charge wedding parties and groups that want to meet in the church building a fee to pay for the use of the building. Some churches operate food catering services or guest houses to generate income. The possibilities for income generating projects are almost unlimited. Christ has given us his mind. Let's put it to use to build up the church, because as you do that, that will simply mean more money can go into discipleship and go into mission. Just remember, as I end this lecture, business or generating income is a means. It's not the end. It's a means to further the mission and purpose of the church. And it should not become or overwhelm the church's primary mission and purpose. See, money is a good thing. We all need it. We all want it. We all wish we had more than we had. And that's true for churches as well as individuals. But we need to keep in mind that it is a tool. It's an important tool, but it's a tool to achieve the goals of the gospel, which are sending out the gospel, making disciples of all the nations, discipling people, engaging with your community, and showing people that in this church, Jesus is alive. He's the head of this church. He's changed our lives. And through what he is doing in us and through us, he is changing this village, this community, and affecting many hundreds, if not thousands of people. So finances are important. Get your finances in order, and you will see God start to bless you in ways that he has not done so far.